The universe has signaled a new beginning for you, and you'll understand why in this video. There is something happening inside you that you have not been able to name, not a problem you can solve, not an emotion you can reason away, something quieter than that, and heavier. A feeling that sits just beneath the surface of your daily life, present when you wake, present when you try to sleep, present in the middle of conversations where you smile and nod and say you are fine. You are not fine, and some part of you has known that for longer than you are willing to admit. You have tried to manage it. You have made plans, set goals, restructured your routines, told yourself that things will be different when this situation resolves, when that relationship stabilizes, when life finally decides to cooperate. But the feeling does not leave, because the feeling is not about your circumstances. It never was. What you are carrying right now is not the weight of a difficult season. It is the pressure of a soul standing at a threshold it does not yet recognize as a door. This video was not built to comfort you with beautiful words. It was built to tell you the truth, the kind that does not make noise when it arrives, but rearranges something permanent inside you. What you are about to hear is a map, a precise, honest, deeply human map of the interior journey every soul must take, when the life it has been living is no longer large enough to contain the person it is becoming. There are 12 chapters ahead of you. Each one was written for the exact version of you that exists in this moment, not the version that has everything figured out, but the one sitting with questions that feel too large for ordinary answers. You did not find this video. You were brought to it. And the part of you that already knows that is the part this video was made for. Stay with it. What is waiting at the end is not information. It is recognition. And you have been ready for it longer than you know. The 3 a.m. that changes everything. You know the hour. You have lived it more times than you can count. It is not always literally 3 in the morning. Sometimes it arrives at noon, in the middle of a meal, in the pause between one sentence and the next. But when it comes, it carries the same quality of silence, the same specific weight. There is a kind of suffering that does not make headlines. It does not arrive with the urgency of a crisis or the clarity of a definable loss. You cannot point to it. You cannot explain it to someone over coffee. The people around you see someone who is functioning, managing, showing up, and you let them see that because the alternative, admitting that something inside you is unraveling, feels like a surrender you are not ready for. But in that hour, in that specific, unguarded hour, the performance stops, and what is left is just you, awake in the dark, with a chest that feels heavier than it should and a feeling you can only describe as being somehow out of place in your own life. Not lost exactly, not broken exactly, just displaced. As if the life you are living and the life you are meant to live have drifted apart, so gradually you did not notice until the distance became impossible to ignore. Most people respond by trying to fix something external. They change habits, environments, relationships. They stay busier, sleep less, anything to avoid sitting with what the silence is actually trying to say. Here is what no one tells you about that feeling. It is not a malfunction. That restlessness, the one that wakes you at 3 in the morning, is not the sound of your life falling apart. It is the sound of your soul reaching the edge of a version of itself it has outgrown. Ancient wisdom traditions across centuries have described this moment with striking consistency. The dark night of the soul, as St. John of the Cross named it, was never conceived as defeat. It was understood as a sacred threshold, the necessary dissolution that precedes a deeper, more authentic form of being. What the mystic called the dark night, Carl Jung would later describe as the individuation crisis, the moment the self can no longer sustain the identity it has constructed and begins, often painfully, to expand toward something truer. You are not in crisis. You are in initiation. A crisis demands that you recover and return to what you were before. An initiation requires that you never fully return, because the person who entered it and the person who emerges are not the same. The 3 in the morning you have been enduring is not a problem. It is a door. And the fact that you can feel it, that you have not numbed yourself completely, is not weakness. It is the universe choosing someone awake enough to receive what it is about to show them. Why the universe speaks in collapse, not in clarity. Most people spend their lives waiting for a sign that looks like an open door, a clear opportunity, a sudden shift in fortune that arrives with enough brightness to be unmistakable. They wait for the moment when everything aligns, when the path ahead becomes obvious, when the right answer announces itself without ambiguity. That moment rarely comes, and the waiting for it is itself one of the great spiritual misunderstandings of human experience, because the universe does not primarily speak in open doors. It speaks in collapses. It speaks in the relationship that ends without warning and leaves you standing in the middle of a life you suddenly do not recognize. In the career that dissolves, the plan that fails, the certainty you built your identity around that one day simply stops being true. In the friendship that quietly fades, in the dream that does not survive contact with reality, in the version of the future you held so carefully that when it slipped from your hands you did not know who you were without it. These are not the absences of divine guidance. These are divine guidance. In its most precise and most misunderstood form, the Hermetic principle of correspondence teaches that every outer movement reflects an inner truth. As above, so below. When something in the external world collapses, it is not arbitrary destruction. It is the outer world reorganizing itself to reflect a shift that has already occurred at the level of the soul. The collapse is not the problem. The collapse is the message. Consider every significant loss you have carried. Not minor inconveniences, the real ones. The ones that changed the shape of your days. Ask yourself honestly, what did each of those losses ultimately clear away? What belief, what relationship, what version of yourself could not have been released any other way? The soul in pain rarely has the perspective to see, in the middle of its breaking, that the thing being taken was never truly yours to keep, not because you did not deserve it, but because it belonged to a chapter that was completing itself. Chapters must end before the next one can begin. The universe does not tear pages from a story out of cruelty. It turns them with purpose. The relationship that ended was not evidence that you are unlovable. It was a redirection toward a quality of love your soul had not yet learned to ask for. The plan that failed was not evidence that you are incapable. It was a redirection toward a path your ego would never have chosen but your soul had always needed. Every collapse in your life has been a form of cosmic navigation. A course correction made not by a distant and indifferent universe but by the same intelligence that knows the exact weight of every unspoken longing in your chest. You were not abandoned. You were redirected. And the fact that it hurt, that it cost you something real, does not diminish the truth of that. Pain is not evidence against purpose. Sometimes pain is the only language precise enough to reach a soul that has learned to sleep through everything quieter. The version of you that fear built. There is a version of you that was constructed entirely in response to pain, not chosen deliberately. Built the way a body builds scar tissue, automatically, efficiently, without asking for your permission. Shaped by every moment you learned that vulnerability led to hurt, that trust led to betrayal, that hope extended too far led to a fall that took longer to recover from than you expected. It is not a villain. That is the first thing to understand. It was, at the moment of its creation, an act of profound intelligence. The mind of a person who has been hurt does not produce defense mechanisms out of stupidity. It produces them out of a deeply rational commitment to never experiencing that specific pain again. Every wall you built had a reason. The problem is not that these structures were built. The problem is that they were never meant to be permanent, and somewhere along the way they became the architecture of your entire life. Think about the patterns you have noticed in yourself. The way you pull back at a certain point in relationships, right before the depth becomes real. The way you self-sabotage when something genuinely good begins to take shape. The way you have learned to want things at a distance. To desire from behind glass where the longing feels safe, because it never fully commits to the risk of actually reaching. The way you have become extraordinarily capable of surviving and almost entirely unwilling to thrive. These are not personality traits. They are survival strategies that outlived the threats they were designed for. Psychologists who study attachment use the term adaptive self, the version of a person that adapted so successfully to a painful environment that the adaptations themselves became the obstacle to experiencing anything better. The child who learned to stay small to avoid conflict eventually becomes the adult who cannot occupy the full space of their own potential. And here is what fear does that is perhaps its most sophisticated operation. It does not always announce itself as fear. It arrives as pragmatism. I am just being realistic. As wisdom, I have learned not to expect too much. As self-sufficiency, I do not need anyone. These translations are convincing because they contain partial truths, but underneath each one is the same ancient voice that decided, at some point in your history, that the world was not safe enough to be fully open in. That voice is not your wisdom. It is your wound speaking in the language of wisdom. What the universe has been trying to reach through every collapse and redirection is not the fear-built version of you. That version cannot receive what is being prepared. Its walls now block not only the pain they were designed to stop, but everything else. The love, the expansion, the depth of aliveness that is the actual inheritance of a soul willing to be present without armor. What is being called forward is the version underneath, the one that existed before the first wound taught you to be careful. That version did not disappear. It went quiet. It learned to wait. And it has been waiting with a patience that should honestly astonish you for the moment you became willing to look at what fear built and understand it not as your identity, but as the chrysalis. Not what you are. What you were wrapped in while you became what you are. Letting go without losing yourself. There is a conversation that happens in spiritual circles with a frequency that has made it almost meaningless. 2 words, spoken with the confidence of someone who has arrived somewhere, offered to someone still in the middle of the hardest thing they have ever tried to carry. Let go. You have heard it. You may have even said it to yourself in that 3 a.m. hour, with genuine intention to follow through. And then the next morning arrived, and the thing you were supposed to release was still there, still as present as it was before you attempted the surrender, and so you concluded that the problem was you. That there is a skill others possess, some clean capacity for release, that you were not issued at birth. That conclusion is wrong. The failure was never yours. The failure was in the instruction. Let go treats attachment as a decision, as if the thing keeping you connected to a person, an identity, or a future you had mapped out with precision is simply a choice you could equally unmake, as if grief is a fist and release is just the act of opening your hand. But you are not holding on with your hand. You are holding on with your nervous system, with the part of your brain that encodes meaning and survival and identity into the things you love and lose. And the nervous system does not respond to instructions. It responds to felt experience. It responds to safety. It responds to the slow accumulation of evidence that release will not destroy you. True release does not begin with letting go. It begins with understanding what you are actually holding. Not the surface version, the deeper one. What does holding this give me? What need does this attachment serve? What would I have to feel, or face, or become, if I were no longer organized around this particular loss? Because every attachment that refuses to release is protecting something. Not the thing itself, it is protecting the version of yourself that was built in relation to that thing. The identity that formed around it. Letting go, in its truest sense, is never really about releasing the other. It is about releasing the version of yourself that needed that particular thing to feel complete. And that is a far more profound act of courage than simply deciding to stop holding on. The mystic Meister Eckhart wrote of a radical interior freedom, not the absence of feeling, but a freedom that can love fully and still not require the loved thing to remain in order to remain whole. That quality is not achieved by force. It is grown in the space created when you stop fighting your attachment and start getting curious about it. There is also something that the instruction to let go almost always omits: the grief. The full, unmanaged, completely legitimate grief of losing something that mattered. Grief is not the obstacle to release. Grief is the process of release. It is the soul doing the actual work of integration, metabolizing a loss into wisdom, converting the space left behind from emptiness into availability. You cannot rush grief into letting go, but you can grieve so honestly, so completely that one day, not the day you planned for, you reach the other side and discover that your hands are open, not because you forced them, because the thing you were carrying finally became lighter than your capacity to carry it, because you grew larger than the loss. When stillness feels like dying, there is a particular discomfort that the modern world has almost no language for, because the modern world has organized itself almost entirely around its avoidance. It is the discomfort of stillness, of having nothing urgent to manage, of sitting inside a moment that is not a crisis, not a task, not a problem positioned neatly in front of you, with the implicit promise that effort will produce resolution, of being, without the scaffolding of doing. For most people, that experience does not feel like rest. It feels like threat, like something is wrong, like the absence of noise is itself a kind of noise, more unsettling than anything the noise was covering. Like the moment you stop moving, the things you have been outrunning finally have a chance to catch up with you, and so the impulse is immediate and almost involuntary. Reach for the phone, start a conversation, create a task, find a distraction, generate some forward motion, because stillness feels, in the nervous system of someone who has learned to survive through action, uncomfortably close to dying. This is not metaphor. This is physiology. The nervous system that has spent years in a state of activation does not experience stillness as neutral. It experiences it as suspicious, as the quiet before something goes wrong. The body that learned that rest is not safe will resist it with everything it has. Not because it is broken, because it is faithfully executing a very old survival program written before you had any say in its creation. Every insight you have ever needed was waiting in the stillness, not in the next book or the next conversation or the next plan. In the stillness, in the specific, uncomfortable silence you have been filling with everything you could find. The Sufi poets understood this. Rumi wrote about the soul's longing as a flute cut from the reed bed, an instrument whose music comes not from what is added to it, but from the hollow space within it. The emptiness is not the absence of the music. The emptiness is where the music lives. A flute that is filled with something meant to replace the hollow cannot make the sound it was made to make. You have been filling the hollow. The contemplative traditions, across Buddhism, Christian mysticism, Sufism, Stoicism, converge on this with a consistency that transcends culture and century. The interior life does not reveal itself to the busy mind. It reveals itself to the quiet one, not because the universe rewards patience, but because the signal is subtle. The frequency on which your deepest wisdom broadcasts is easily drowned out by the frequency on which your fear and distraction operate. You cannot hear a whisper in a room full of shouting, and most people's inner lives are rooms full of shouting. The path to stillness is not simply deciding to be still, because the moment you sit down, everything you have been not feeling will begin to surface. Every unprocessed grief, every suppressed fear, they do not wait politely. They arrive with the urgency of things that have been waiting a long time. This is not punishment. This is thawing. When something frozen begins to melt, there is turbulence. But numbness was never stability. It was the appearance of stability. A managed stillness requiring constant energy to maintain. The thawing is not the wound reopening. The thawing is the wound finally being allowed to heal. What comes through stillness, once you stop fighting it, is something no amount of motion could deliver. Clarity. Not the brittle clarity of a decision made under pressure, but the specific, quiet, unshakable clarity that comes from contact with your own interior truth. The kind that does not need to be defended or explained. The kind that simply knows. Stillness is not dying. It is the opposite. The specific condition under which the most essential parts of you remember that they are alive. The lies you are taught to call truth. Before you were old enough to question anything, you were already being filled. Not maliciously in most cases. Not by people who decided deliberately to install limitations where there had been freedom. It happened the way most consequential things happen, quietly, incrementally, through repetition and osmosis. Children do not yet have the cognitive architecture to evaluate what they are being given. They only have the capacity to receive it. And so they receive everything, the love and the fear, the wisdom and the wound, with equal and indiscriminate openness. What was received became over time the furniture of your interior life. So familiar you stopped seeing it. So present you began to mistake it for the walls themselves rather than for something placed against them. These are the beliefs you did not choose, the ones that arrived before choice was available, the ones that have been shaping your decisions, your relationships, and your understanding of what is possible for a person like you, for so long that they have acquired the texture of simple fact. They are not facts. They are inherited conclusions, and that distinction matters enormously. There is a category of these inherited conclusions that deserves direct examination, the ones taught not through explicit instruction, but through demonstrated reality. Not you are not enough spoken aloud, but the accumulation of 1,000 smaller moments in which enoughness was conditional, in which love arrived in response to performance, in which the message, never stated, therefore never available to be challenged, was that your worthiness was a variable rather than a constant. A child cannot locate that limitation outside themselves. A child concludes that the limitation is them, and that conclusion, made before language, before logic, goes underground. It becomes the operating assumption from which everything else is calculated. And so you grew up knowing, in the way you know things that precede knowing, that love has a price, that belonging requires performance, that the authentic, unedited version of yourself is somehow not quite right for the rooms you are trying to occupy. You learned to edit yourself. You developed a curated version, one that anticipated the conditions required for acceptance and preemptively met them, so that the terrifying moment of being seen fully and found wanting never had to arrive. And then you carried that curation into every room you entered afterward, into relationships where genuine intimacy was available, but required a risk you had already decided was not survivable, into opportunities that called for the fullness of what you actually are, but which you approached with the smaller, more palatable version, and then felt confused by the gap between what you offered and what you secretly knew you were capable of. This is not a character flaw. It is the entirely logical outcome of a very early education in what the world requires of you to be acceptable. But logic does not make it true. The philosopher Alfred Korzybski offered a formulation that has survived because of its precision. The map is not the territory. The belief about reality is not reality. And when the map is wrong, when it was drawn by frightened or wounded cartographers who did their best with limited tools, navigating by it will take you somewhere you did not intend to go. Most of the beliefs you carry about your worth, your capacity, your lovability, they are maps drawn in childhood by people navigating by their own inherited maps, most of which were also wrong, accurate about the dangers, silent about the possibilities, unable to show you the territory that exists beyond the edges of what the mapmaker was willing to imagine. The edges of your map are not the edges of the world. Unlearning a belief that arrived before language is not the work of an afternoon. The belief lives in the body as much as in the mind, in the way your chest tightens at the approach of real intimacy, in the way success in areas that matter deeply feels less like arrival and more like exposure, like standing in a light you are not sure you deserve. The body updates slowly, through repeated experiences of safety where it predicted danger, through the accumulation of evidence that the world does not end when you are fully seen, that the authentic version of you, unedited, unperformed, genuinely present, does not drive away the things worth keeping. It is the only version capable of attracting them. The lies you were taught to call truth are not your identity. They are your inheritance. And unlike some inheritances, this one can be examined, disputed, and ultimately declined. Becoming comfortable with not knowing. The mind that needs certainty is a mind in quiet crisis, not obviously, not in the way that announces itself with the clarity of a breakdown, but in the persistent tension of a person who cannot fully rest until the future is resolved, who cannot be fully present in this moment because this moment does not yet contain the answer to the question consuming most of their interior bandwidth. What happens next? Whether it works out? Whether the choice was right? You know this tension. It may be so familiar that you have stopped recognizing it as tension at all. It has become the baseline, the ambient hum of a mind that learned uncertainty was not a neutral condition to be inhabited, but a problem to be solved. And so you have been thinking, and planning, and gathering information, and running scenarios. And the uncertainty has not resolved, because the kind that most deeply unsettles the human soul is not the kind that more information can touch. It is the uncertainty about whether you will be okay, whether the things you love will remain, whether you are, in some fundamental sense, safe. That kind of uncertainty cannot be thought away. It can only be inhabited. The ancient Greeks had a word, aporia, that philosophers used to describe genuine puzzlement, being in a question without resolution, standing at the edge of what can be known without the comfort of an answer. For Socrates, aporia was not the failure of the philosophical enterprise. It was the beginning of genuine wisdom. The person who knows that they do not know is closer to truth than the person who never questioned their certainties at all. There is a dignity in not knowing that our culture has largely abandoned. We have built entire industries around the elimination of uncertainty, feeding a collective illusion that uncertainty is a temporary condition on the way to certainty, a problem of insufficient data that more data will eventually solve. We have trained ourselves to experience the absence of certainty not as a natural feature of a living existence, but as a malfunction. And so when the certainty does not come, when the answer refuses to arrive, when the path forward remains genuinely unclear, you conclude that you are failing at something, that a more capable version of you would be handling this ambiguity with a grace you cannot locate. But there is no version of you immune to the discomfort of not knowing. There is only a more practiced version, one who has sat inside uncertainty enough times to have accumulated evidence that it does not last forever, that clarity does eventually arrive, and that the waiting has never once failed to yield something worth having on the other side. The Zen practice of the koan, the unsolvable riddle designed to break the rational mind's insistence on resolution, is a precise instrument for dismantling the very mechanism that makes uncertainty unbearable. When the mind is given a question it cannot answer through ordinary cognition and is instructed to sit with the not knowing, something begins to shift beneath the level of thought. The grip loosens, the urgency softens, and in the space that opens when the relentless pursuit of resolution finally pauses, a different quality of awareness becomes available. That stability is not the stability of certainty. It is something more durable, the stability of a self that has learned to rest in its own presence, rather than in the resolution of external questions. What the contemplative traditions call equanimity. Not indifference, not caring. The capacity to care completely and still not be destabilized by the absence of guarantees. The anxious mind experiences the open question as empty, a void where the answer should be. But the open question is not empty. It is full of possibility that certainty would foreclose, full of directions that premature resolution would eliminate, full of the specific creative potential that only exists in the space between what was and what has not yet become. Every significant transformation passes through a period of not knowing. There is no version of becoming that bypasses the uncertainty of transition, the in-between space where the old identity has dissolved and the new one has not yet formed. This space is not the failure of the transformation, it is the transformation itself. The people who move through it most intact are not the ones who found a way to eliminate the discomfort. They are the ones who stopped trying to, who discovered that the discomfort of not knowing is survivable, that the open question, fully inhabited, is not the enemy of peace. It is, in its own strange way, the condition under which the most genuine peace becomes possible. The emotions you were never allowed to have. There is a hierarchy of acceptable feelings that most people absorb so early and so completely that they have entirely forgotten it is a hierarchy, forgotten that what feels like emotional reality is, in significant part, an edited version of emotional reality. One that has been passing through a filter so long the filter has become invisible. You learned which feelings were welcome. Joy, usually, though not too exuberant, not in ways that made others uncomfortable. Gratitude, calm. The emotions that made you easier to be around, that asked nothing of the people nearby, that did not require anyone to adjust their own internal weather in response to yours. And you learned which feelings were not welcome. Anger, perhaps, particularly if you were someone for whom anger was coded as dangerous or unbecoming. Grief that went on too long. Need in its more naked forms. The feelings that made you inconvenient. The ones that asked something of the people nearby, that created a pressure in the room that others wanted resolved, and so you resolved it for them. You learned to resolve your own uncomfortable feelings before they could become someone else's discomfort. You learned to move through sadness quietly, to compress anger into something more presentable, to translate your need into a form so indirect that it could be declined without either party having to acknowledge that a request had been made. You became, in the emotional dimension of your life, extraordinarily self-sufficient. And that self-sufficiency was praised, called maturity, called strength, called emotional intelligence. And it was those things in part, but it was also something else. The internalization of the message that your full emotional reality was more than the world around you was willing to hold. The psychologist Bessel van der Kolk spent decades studying what happens to emotions that are not processed, that are suppressed, overridden, managed into silence before they complete their natural arc. His conclusion, supported by extensive neurological research, is that they do not disappear. They relocate into the body, into behavior, into the immune system and the nervous system and the patterns of relationship that seem to repeat across years with a consistency that baffles the conscious mind. The emotion that has no outlet does not resolve. It persists. In the chronic tension held in specific muscles, in the reactivity that arrives suddenly and disproportionately in situations that seem to have little to do with anything that matters, in the numbness that gradually replaces feeling in areas where feeling became too costly to maintain. Emotions are not performances. They are not social tools, deployed strategically in appropriate contexts and withdrawn when the context shifts. They are information, precise, embodied, often inconvenient information about your actual interior state. And the suppression of that information does not make it false. It makes it inaccessible to your conscious processing, while it continues to operate at every other level of your system. What would it mean to allow the feelings you were never allowed to have? Not to perform them, not to externalize every interior state as a demand on the people around you, but simply to let them be present. To stop reaching for the override before the feeling has completed what it came to do. To sit inside the anger long enough to hear what it is protecting. To stay with the grief long enough to let it tell you what it is mourning. To let the need be real, even if only in the privacy of your own acknowledgement, rather than immediately translating it into something more acceptable. This is not a regression. It is not the abandonment of the emotional regulation that makes adult life possible. It is the discovery of the difference between regulation and suppression, between consciously choosing how and when to express an emotion and unconsciously eliminating it before it is allowed to inform you. Your feelings are not the problem. They are the most direct line of communication available between the surface of your life and its depths, and you have been declining the call for a very long time. Grief is not a problem to be solved. We have made grief into something to be managed. This is understandable. Grief is among the most destabilizing of human experiences. It removes the floor from beneath ordinary life, makes the familiar strange, and introduces a pain that does not respond to the usual mechanisms by which pain is addressed. You cannot think your way out of it. You cannot fix what caused it. You cannot negotiate with it or arrive at its resolution on any schedule you or the people around you would prefer. And so, because we are a culture with an extraordinary relationship with problem solving, and a much more limited relationship with sitting inside what cannot be solved, we have imported the language of management into the experience of loss. We speak of grief in stages, as if it moved in orderly progression toward a destination called acceptance. We speak of closure, as if loss were a wound that eventually seals. We speak of moving on, as if the appropriate relationship to what was lost is eventually to place enough distance between yourself and it that it no longer shapes your present. These frameworks emerged from genuine attempts to provide comfort, but they have done quiet damage because they have taught grieving people to evaluate their grief rather than inhabit it, to assess whether it is proceeding correctly, whether it has gone on too long, whether they should be further along by now, and to experience the natural complexity of genuine mourning as evidence that they are grieving incorrectly. There is no incorrect grieving. There is only grieving, the profound, disorienting, deeply human process of adjusting to a world that no longer contains what it contained before. The psychologist William Worden offered a reframe that carries genuine insight. He suggested thinking not of grief stages but of grief's tasks, not a passive moving through of predetermined phases, but an active engagement with the work of mourning, the work of acknowledging the reality of the loss, the work of living through the pain rather than around it, the work of adjusting to a world in which what was lost is absent, the work of finding a way to remain connected to what was lost while still reinvesting in the ongoing life. These tasks do not resolve. They are returned to. Grief is not a straight line. It is a spiral. You revisit the same places, but from different positions, with different capacities. What was unbearable at one point in the spiral becomes, not bearable exactly, but something that can be stood inside without being destroyed by it. The death of someone you loved completely does not become okay. It becomes something you carry differently over time, with more skill, with more evidence that the carrying has not broken you, with a relationship to the absence that deepens rather than diminishes. In some sense, those we lose become more fully present, freed from the contingency of the living relationship. They take up residence in the deepest places, in the values they shaped, in the specific quality of love they introduced you to. This is not resolution. It is integration. And integration is a richer, more honest, more genuinely honoring thing than closure. What the cultural narrative of managed grief most fundamentally misunderstands is the nature of love. Love creates attachment, not as a pathology but as its very purpose. To love someone is to allow them to matter to you, to permit their existence to shape yours, to build a world in which they are a structural element, and when that element is removed, the world does not need to be closed around the gap. It needs to be rebuilt, slowly, incompletely, with full acknowledgement of what is missing, into something that can hold both the absence and the continuing life. That rebuilding takes exactly as long as it takes. You are allowed to grieve slowly. You are allowed to have days, years later, when the loss arrives with a freshness that surprises you, a quality of light in a particular season, a song, a smell, a moment of joy so genuine that your first instinct is to turn to someone who is no longer there. That turning and the finding of absence is its own small, fresh grief. It does not mean you have failed to heal. It means the love was real, and the love is still real. Grief is not the opposite of love. It is love's most honest expression in the face of absence. Carry it as long as you need to. Carry it gently, and know that the carrying of it is not the obstacle to your full life. In many ways, it is the evidence that you have already been living one. Boundaries are not walls. There is a confusion at the center of how most people learn to think about boundaries, that a boundary is something you build against another person, rather than something you build for yourself. A wall is built against. It is defensive, designed to keep something out to maintain a perimeter. Walls work, but they work indiscriminately. They keep out what is harmful and what is nourishing with equal efficiency. The person living behind them is protected from hurt, in the same measure they are protected from genuine contact. A boundary is something else entirely. A boundary is not built against another person. It is built from an understanding of yourself, from an honest assessment of what you need to remain whole, what you can give without depleting yourself, what kinds of treatment you are willing to receive. A boundary is the external expression of an internal truth, and because it comes from truth rather than fear, it has a completely different quality in relationship. It does not close the other person out, it tells them where you actually are, which is, paradoxically, the precondition for genuine closeness, rather than its obstacle. Most people who struggle with boundaries are not struggling because they do not know what a boundary is. They are struggling because somewhere in their development, they learned that having needs was itself a form of imposition, that expressing a limit was a form of rejection, that to say this does not work for me was to communicate you are not wanted here. And so the child who grew up in that system learned to equate self-erasure with love, learned that the appropriate response to their own needs was to make them smaller, quieter, less inconvenient to the people whose approval they depended on for their sense of safety. That child became an adult who does not know how to say no without a wave of guilt that feels disproportionate to the situation, who over-explains and over-apologizes when declining a request, who feels responsible for managing the emotional responses of the people around them to the limits they set, as if the discomfort another person feels upon encountering a boundary is a problem caused by the boundary rather than information about the other person's relationship with limits. Here is what is true that the people-pleasing pattern obscures. You are not responsible for how another person responds to your boundary. You are responsible for communicating it clearly, kindly, and honestly. What the other person does with that communication, whether they receive it with understanding or with hurt, or with the particular pressure designed to make you reconsider, is not yours to manage. Relationships calibrate to patterns. When the pattern has been one of consistent accommodation, any deviation will register as disruption. This is not a sign that the boundary is unkind. It is the predictable response of a system encountering change. And the appropriate response is not to retract the boundary to restore the previous equilibrium. It is to hold it long enough for the relationship to recalibrate around it. Some relationships will not survive this recalibration. This is painful, and it is also important information. A relationship that can only survive in the absence of your limits does not have room for you, for the actual you, the one with needs and edges. The ending of a relationship that cannot survive your realness is not a failure of the boundary. It is the boundary performing its most essential function, revealing the actual architecture of the connection. You do not need permission to have limits. You do not need to earn the right to your own needs through sufficient selflessness in other areas. You are a person, which means you have a shape. A boundary is simply the honest description of that shape. And offering it to the people in your life, instead of the shapeless accommodation they may have come to expect, is not a withdrawal of love. It is, finally, the offer of something real, the exhaustion of pretending to be fine. There is a particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. You know this tired. It is the tired that accumulates not from physical exertion, but from the sustained effort of presenting a version of yourself that does not match the version actually present inside you. The tired of the smile that is technically accurate, but not quite true. Of the I'm fine that functions as social lubricant rather than a report on your actual condition. Of the performance of okayness maintained across hours and days and sometimes years, so consistently that you occasionally lose track of where the performance ends and the actual self begins. The performance has a name: emotional labor. The sociologist Arlie Hochschild introduced the concept in her study of people whose jobs required them to actively manage their displayed emotions. But the concept escaped its occupational origins immediately, because what Hochschild had named was not a workplace phenomenon. It was a human one. The labor of managing how you appear to feel in the service of something, social harmony, others' comfort, the particular relational economy of a family system that required certain emotions to be visible and others to remain hidden. Most people are performing emotional labor constantly. The question is only whether they know it. The ones who do not know it experience it as a vague but persistent depletion, a flatness, a joylessness, a sense that they are moving through their life rather than inhabiting it. A feeling that genuine enthusiasm has become inaccessible, that connection is happening at a surface level even in relationships that should by their nature be deep. This is what chronic self-suppression feels like from the inside. Not dramatic, not acute, but a steady and cumulative dimming of the quality of experience. The culture actively reinforces it. Strong people do not complain. Resilient people do not display their struggles. There is something real in each of these observations. Not everything needs to be externalized. Not every emotional state requires an audience. But the cultural overcorrection has produced a norm in which the suppression of genuine interior experience is confused with emotional health, in which the performance of stability is mistaken for actual stability. They are not the same thing. And the confusion between them is costing people their actual lives. It costs the quality of your relationships, which can only reach the depth of your honest disclosure. Intimacy is built not on the management of your presentation, but on the willingness to be seen without management. It costs your relationship with your own emotional life, which, like any system that receives consistent signals that its outputs are unwelcome, eventually begins to go quieter, to communicate less. The person who has spent years overriding their emotional responses does not develop better emotional regulation. They develop emotional numbness, which feels like stability, and is actually its opposite. It costs your body. The research on emotional suppression and physical health is extensive and consistent. Chronically suppressed emotion does not disappear, it relocates. Into the musculature, into the immune system, into the cardiovascular system. The body keeps, as Bessel van der Kolk demonstrated, the score. And it costs your presence. Your actual embodied available presence in your own life. The energy perpetually allocated to the management of appearance is not available for experience. The part of consciousness devoted to the performance is not available for the living. What sits at the opposite end of the spectrum from pretending to be fine is not radical emotional disclosure to anyone within range. It is something quieter and more demanding. It is the simple, private, unglamorous practice of telling yourself the truth, of taking honest inventory, not for anyone else, not for disclosure, of what is actually present, what you are actually feeling, what is actually difficult, what you are actually carrying, and how heavy it actually is. This internal honesty does not require external expression to be valuable. What it requires is that the gap between your interior reality and your presented self become visible to you, that you stop performing the okayness so consistently that you lose track of the fact that it is a performance. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to be something other than fine. The real one, the tired, unfinished, entirely sufficient real one, is waiting. The new beginning that was always yours. You have arrived at the end of this journey knowing something you did not know at the beginning, or perhaps remembering something you had forgotten so gradually that the forgetting itself became invisible, that you were never broken, not in the way you feared, not in the permanent, structural, irreversible way that the hardest chapters of your life may have convinced you. The breaking you experienced was real. The pain was real. The losses were real, and they cost you real things. Versions of yourself, versions of the future, versions of trust and openness and ease that may still be in the process of being recovered. But breaking is not the same as being broken. And the fact that you are here, that you followed this all the way through, that some part of you was willing to sit inside these questions rather than reach immediately for the nearest distraction, is not a small thing. It is evidence of the very quality that makes what comes next possible. The new beginning. The universe has been signaling is not an event. It is not a moment that will arrive from the outside with enough brightness to be unmistakable. You have spent enough of your life waiting for that moment to know by now that it does not come that way. It comes the way dawn does. Not announced, not sudden, but present. Simply, quietly, undeniably present. The darkness is no longer there. And you realize, looking back, that the light did not arrive all at once. It had been arriving, one increment at a time, through every question you were willing to ask, every wall you were willing to examine, every layer of the fear-built self you were willing to see clearly without turning away. The new beginning is not ahead of you. It is underneath you. It has been forming in the dark the way foundations form, invisibly, under pressure, taking the shape of what will eventually be built above them. What is being built is not a new version of the life you had before. It is not a recovery of what was lost, or a return to who you were before the losses. It is something that does not have a name yet, because it has not fully arrived yet, because you are still in the passage, still in the territory between the old story and the new one, still in the discomfort of the in-between that every genuine transformation requires. But you know something now that you did not know before you entered this passage. You know that the collapse was navigation, that the restlessness was a signal, that the fear-built self was a chrysalis, not a sentence, that the emotions you were never allowed to have are not chaos to be managed but information to be received, that grief is love's most honest expression in the face of absence, not a problem to be resolved, that your limits are not walls, but the honest description of your shape, that the exhaustion of pretending to be fine is not strength but its quiet opposite, and that the real version of you, the unperformed, unedited, genuinely present version, is not too much for the world. It is exactly enough. It is, in fact, the only version capable of living the life that is waiting. That life is not a reward for having suffered enough. It is not compensation for what was taken. It is simply what becomes available when a person is willing to stop navigating by a map that was never accurate and begin, slowly and with considerable uncertainty, to trust the terrain. The terrain is here. You are on it. You have been on it all along. The universe has not been silent. It has been speaking. In every collapse that redirected you, in every sleepless hour that refused to let you stay unconscious, in every moment of inexplicable grief that turned out to be grief for a version of yourself you were ready to outgrow, it has been speaking in the only language precise enough to reach you. And you heard it. You are here. You stayed. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. The new beginning is not coming. It has already begun.